Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 5, Episode 1 of the Trading Without Borders podcast. This season launches a six-part mini-series titled Strengthening Manufacturing and Agro-processing in Africa. The series is designed to bridge the gap between high-level policy ambition and on-the-ground operational reality. And today in Episode 1, we begin with a foundational question, the industrial imperative. Can Africa manufacture its way into the future? But more importantly, what does this mean in practical terms for African trade? The African Continental Free Trade Area opens access to a projected 3.4 trillion USD unified market. Yet, access alone is not transformation. The real question is this: will Africa simply trade more raw materials across borders, or will it trade more value-added goods? Across the continent, we have strong policy frameworks, ambitious trade agreements, and bold industrial visions. But businesses continue to struggle with production bottlenecks, infrastructure gaps, energy constraints, financing challenges, and regulatory inconsistencies. The gap between ambition and implementation is where today's conversation sits. This episode is focused on bridging the space between political will and factory floor reality. So, as you listen, I invite you to reflect on one central question: can Africa move from being primarily a supplier of raw materials to becoming a competitive manufacturing powerhouse under the AFCFTA? Because trading without borders only works when systems work in the real world. According to the United Nations, industrial development is critical for sustained and inclusive economic growth in African countries. Industry enhances productivity, builds workforce capabilities, generates employment, introduces innovation and technology, and strengthens domestic value chains. And importantly, industrialization, when deeply linked to domestic economies, helps countries diversify away from commodity dependence, reduce vulnerability to external shocks, and accelerate poverty reduction through job creation and wealth generation. So industrialization is not just an economic objective, it is a structural transformation strategy. Today, we are joined by a distinguished guest who will help us unpack the real meaning of the 3.4 trillion AFCFTA opportunity, what an industrialization roadmap under the AFCFTA actually looks like, why implementation and not policy drafting will determine success, and how we move from continental vision to operational execution. Our esteemed guest today is Chima Trike. Chima has 16 years of experience in government advisory and industrial and private sector development policies. She is a co-founder and managing director at Growth Themes, which aims to empower key government agencies in developing countries to problem solve for growth, investment, and jobs. Prior to this, she was the head of industrialization at the Tony Blair Institute, covering and overseeing TBI's, that's Tony Blair's Institute, work on industrialization and industrial policy in 17 African countries. She was also a TBI embedded advisor with the Ethiopian government, working on job creation, industrial and employment policies. She has worked with a number of international organizations, including the OECD Private Sector Development in the Middle East and North African region, and with the ILO on structural transfer. The ILO is International Labour Organization, so on structural transformation, investment, and industrial policies. She began her career in management consulting and financial services. She is an engineer in applied mathematics and holds a Master of Public Administration from Sciences to Paris and the London School of Economics with economic policy as a major. It is therefore a great honor to have Chima join the podcast, share insight from a perspective of a stakeholder within the Africa industrialization. Thank you so much, Chima, for agreeing to join me.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you here. An interesting profile there, you being an engineer and now with what you're doing within the state. Now that introductions are done, let's move right into today's episode and go right into our discussion. So my first question for you, Chima, is the AFCFTA's central objective is clear. Move Africa from dependence on primary commodity exports to high-value manufacturing and diversified economic activity through regional value chains, agricultural development, and food security. According to a World Bank blog post, Africa accounts for only about 2% of global manufactured exports, leaving African economies vulnerable to trade shocks, currency volatility, and structural imbalances. Building a manufacturing base is therefore not optional. It is a reliance strategy. Industrialization drives jobs, strengthens public revenues, and lays the foundation for inclusive growth and poverty reduction. So, Chima, in 2026, when we speak of the industrial imperative, what do we really mean? That's my first question for you, Chima.
Thank you for that. So when we talk about industrialization, we historically it has been solely focused on manufacturing for obvious reasons, but maybe worth highlighting is that actually manufacturing allows for higher labor productivity gains than other sectors. It also allows for a higher job creation potential and higher multiplier, employment multiplier in the economy if we compare it to other sectors. But also manufacturing sort of plays a central role in creating forward and backward linkages, so creating demand for agricultural goods, but also for some services, and basically is a central sector within the economy. When we talk about industrialization today, I would argue that manufacturing still has a big role to play, but that we should look at industrialization from a wider perspective, including high value adding value chains in agriculture and then services. But this does not undermine the role that manufacturing could play. It rather complements it. And actually, when we talk about agricultural value chains, today, when we talk about a number of products, including fresh products, the level of technology that can go into, having a farm that produces avocado or sunflower or tomato, whatever, and that these products and then exporting these products specifically when they are fresh actually requires a level of technology that is quite high. And you can see farms today that are use more technologies than some firms in manufacturing. So that's what we mean actually by high value added agriculture is basically products that can consume higher level of technology than other traditional farming. So basically that would obviously contribute to productivity gains, but that also require more sort of sophisticated logistics to get the produce from farms to markets. And that's what we call now, there is what we call the industrialization of freshness. So there is a potential for those value chains in agriculture. There is a potential for manufacturing, as I would argue still continues to be a critical engine of transformation, of economics transformation, or structural transformation. And then also there are some services sector that can help in structural transformation. These tend to be the tradable sectors, because obviously when you trade and when you export, you have access to economies of scale, and that means that you also reduce your cost of production, and ultimately you tap into higher potential for productivity gains. So in a nutshell, when we say industrialization, it doesn't mean only manufacturing, but it is still manufacturing is still central to that agenda. And then you mentioned the AFCFTA. There is a really important sort of thinking and that needs to take place around AFCFTA for African countries, I believe, to really grasp that opportunity. And that is that sure, we have a market of 1.4 billion people, but actually the depth of that market is still very shallow. And a number of industries, when we're talking about more sophisticated products, the demand for those or the markets that we have inside of Africa are still quite shallow. And so the basically the market pooling might hold less promises than what one could or than the 1.4 billion people. That's for sure. But then also there is an opportunity. So that's from the demand side. But then there is an opportunity that should not be neglected. That is on the production side, on the supply side, which is basically building regional value chains, industrial value chains that build on the synergies between different countries and that help us develop vertically integrated industries. And that opportunity is what I'm really excited about, and that we've been trying to drive with the AFCFTA Secretariat and the Nelson Mandela School, and with the Advisory Council for Industrialization for the AFCFTA. So basically, there is a lot of thinking about what are these synergies that exist, what complementarities can exist between different countries, based on which we can build regionally integrated production systems. Because the AFCFTA is should not be looked only as a trade agreement and as a sort of a market access, but it really should be looked at as well as a way to integrate production and to increase our capacity basically to produce together.
Thank you, Chima, for that, and thank you for emphasizing that industrialization is not just manufacturing, which is usually the main thing, but at the same time, it is a very critical engine for transformation. And of course, we've also spoken about the opportunities for regional integrated production systems amongst African countries. So I'm just going to move to my next question, which is, according to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, that's the MSMEs, are the backbone of inclusive and sustainable development. They have the potential to accelerate industrialization, drive high value addition, strengthen economic resilience, and create jobs at scale. Integrating Africa's MSMEs into national, regional, and global value chains is essential to building an inclusive industrialization agenda. In fact, innovation-driven SMEs can be catalysts for real structural transformation. Yet, despite this potential, many SME manufacturers remain locked out of regional value chains. So let me ask, what is the single biggest non-tariff barrier holding back SME manufacturers in Africa today? If we had to dismantle just one non-tariff barrier in 2026 to unlock regional value chains, what would it be? And fundamentally, can industrialization truly happen without serious infrastructure reform?
So I'm going to be a bit provocative here. I believe that this focus on SMEs is the wrong one, and it's is a sort of a development community or the aid industry focus that is not the right focus when we're talking about industrialization. SMEs sure are the backbone of many economies in Africa, just because of the lack of structural transformation and the lack of sophisticated production systems that do not exist rather. So that's why we have SMEs. The high number of SMEs and the fact that they contribute that they are the major job creators and all of that is a problem in itself. It doesn't mean that all these SMEs have a big role to play. It rather means that actually people set up shop to do anything that they can to survive. And actually, when we look into the sort of the details of basically the distribution of these SMEs, you'll find, if you include micro in them, you'll find that there is a huge, basically the overwhelming majority is around micro enterprises that are basically 1-2 people max, and that rely just on their owner, right, without necessarily processes, technology, and all of that enable some sort of learning by doing, and some sort of accumulation of human and technological capital. I think the right focus rather is on how to emerge. How can we help emerging large competitive firms that are African, right? And so there is a need to shift this question from how can we support SMEs to rather how can we focus on high growth SMEs? How can we detect them and help them plug into the global value chains and help them become competitive with the objective of having large players emerging? That's the ultimate game of industrialization, is actually large competitive firms, ideally that are exporting, that are transnational, that are basically operating across number of countries, and that basically that's the real success of industrialization. And this focus on SMEs is almost like a focus on keeping it's almost coming from a perspective of we're not Africa structural transformation is so hard, then let us and that it's almost not feasible. So let us focus on what's feasible next, which is helping the poor survive until tomorrow. But that's not an industrialization agenda. So I just want to reframe the question. It doesn't mean that supporting SMEs is not important, but rather it's how you support them and who you support among these SMEs. Not all SMEs are equal. The high growth ones, definitely you should help them to export, to also become supplier to global actors, to integrate in the global value chains. And I would argue that you need for that to take a real sector perspective, not all SMEs across the board, but rather SMEs that are operating in the most strategic and productive sectors that hold the highest opportunity for your country. Otherwise, you risk basically going a bit wide and not having the multiplier effects that you want in your economy.
Okay, thank you for that. So for you, you have emphasized that support should be for high growth SMEs to become global players. So my question is, one of the core pillars of the African Development Bank I5 priorities under its 10-year strategy is to industrialize Africa by positioning manufacturing as the primary engine of job creation, supported by strengthened infrastructure, particularly energy. Yet a major constraint to achieving this ambition remains Africa's physical and digital infrastructure gap. Challenges such as unreliable and unaffordable power, weak port and transport systems, and limited digital connectivity continue to raise production costs, restrict market access, and undermine the competitiveness of African firms, particularly their ability to adopt digital technologies and integrate into regional and global value chains. So the question here is, how ready and how willing are African countries to decisively close the physical and digital infrastructure gap required for industrialization to succeed?
So here I would argue that first of all, the role of development banks overall is extremely important. And we know that development banks in Africa are not quite well capitalized and do not have, beyond them not necessarily contributing in the right way to industrialization. But they have a big role to play. Every country that has developed has relied on effective development banks contributing to it. Whether China is obviously the biggest example, and of a country that has really leveraged development banks in the best way. For the AFDB, I would come back to that point that I made about regionally integrated production systems. And I think the AFDB can be a big player into making that happen by connecting not only when we talk about, again, the AFCFTA, I think many people are thinking about the trade and the market, but really to unlock what are we trading, and the integration of different production systems that are that can actually make them transform the AFCFTA from just a trade agreement to a development, really to a development tool, and not only a strategic development tool. So I mean, the role there needs to be focused. It's great that they are focusing on manufacturing. I think the role that that they could play is about building the trade corridors, is about building up. Ideally, the way I want to see it playing out is that you have a body, a coordinating body, whether it's the AFCFTA or somewhere sort of at the regional, someone at the regional level defining what are these regional value chains, what are the complementarity synergies in the current production systems, and what are the opportunities that could be built on that, and then the AFDB using that as an input to define which projects are to fund, right? Whether trade corridors that would help build these production systems, whether it is the right custom services, whether it's the right digital systems, but really being sort of at the service of these regional value chains that need to be built. That's how I would see it at the strategic level, and then obviously that would have different angles to it. But I would argue also that National Development Bank, beyond the AFDB, National Development Bank need to step up and need to play a bigger role, including in funding industrialization going forward in a number of countries.
Okay, thank you for that, Chima, for emphasizing the role of National Development Bank as well, complementary what the AFDB is doing regionally. Yes, so I'll move on to my next question on green industrialization. According to the AFDB, helping the continent transition to green growth will require mainstreaming sustainable development through strategic investments in renewable energy, climate-smart agriculture, and sustainable water resource management, among others. But as global markets tighten carbon standards and introduce carbon border adjustment measures, compliance alone will not be enough. So the question is, how can African industries leverage the continent's vast renewable energy potential to secure a competitive advantage in global supply chains rather than simply absorbing the cost of emerging green tariffs? In other words, can green industrialization become Africa's trade advantage rather than a trade barrier?
So first of all, green energy is a really important part of green industrialization, but it is not the only way. It is not the only angle, rather. And in a number of African countries, that question is almost sort of the question of renewable energy is solved because of the natural endowments. In East Africa, for instance, a country like Ethiopia does rely on hydraulic, basically renewable energy for about 95% of its generated energy. The vast resources in water and in solar energy and all of that, of course, offers a huge opportunity for Africa. I would argue that first of all, the opportunities there is to really give access to electricity to Africans. We still have about 600 million people being locked out of electricity access. So there is a huge potential already to increase the level of electricity access to firms and to people on the continent. But there are also, we need to look at green industrialization from a broader lens. It is not only about the energy systems. It is also about different opportunities that are emerging in either the new developed green value chains. So these are basically new emerging value chains in transport and energy, be it the technologies for energy storage, be it electric battery and basically green in transport. But there are also a number of opportunities across a number of manufacturing sectors and a number of agricultural value chains. And those are basically, those opportunities are what Kyunlee, a South Korean economist, called more short cycle technologies that might offer us an opportunity to leapfrog. But that does require a monitoring of what are these technologies emerging, who is innovating these technologies, and how can we tap into that to bring them to Africa, where we have and use them then as a competitive advantage to develop green production systems. I would argue also that for green industrialization, the focus in Africa should be first about if we talk about green growth, the focus for us should be first about growth, then that is green when it's possible. So it is about maximizing the green in the green growth when it's possible, but pursuing first and foremost growth, because ultimately that's the imperative that we have on the continent, considering the poverty levels, considering the demographic growth that we're witnessing, and that we're still going to continue in the next decades. So the green industrialization should not divert, basically the green in growth should not divert us away from growth, but rather the question should be, how can we pursue growth while maximizing green when it's possible?
Okay, thank you for that. You've asked how can we pursue growth whilst maximizing grains when it's possible. So trying to maximize grain should not take us away from growth. That's what should be our focus. And then we'll maximize grain. Okay, so my next question is on financing. I know you had earlier said it's not about SMEs, but supporting high growth SMEs. But I would ask this question. So on the United Nations Economic Commission publication that I'd spoken about earlier, bank credit remains the most viable source of finance for MSMEs in developing countries, yet access to that credit is consistently identified as one of their biggest constraints. On the supply side, limited financial sector development affects the availability of credit, the cost of borrowing, the range of financial products, and the overall quality of financial services. For manufacturing SMEs in particular, where capital expenditure is high and returns are long-term, this financing gap becomes even more critical. So my question is, are banks in Africa truly structured to finance manufacturing, or do they basically support short-term, low-risk commercial lending rather than long-term industrial growth?
Okay, there are two layers actually to answer this. The first thing is that I think the question, we sometimes would jump into the conclusion that access to finance is a big challenge. It is a challenge for a number of sort of entrepreneurs and for people, basically for survivalists, let's say SMEs. However, the other side of, and it is true that the cost of capital is extremely high, but I would argue that there is another side of the story that we tend to overlook, which is the lack of bankable projects to be financed. It's a question. I think we focus a lot on one side of the story, and we do not look enough into the other side of the story. I've worked a couple of years ago with a DFI that had basically a program structured on the manufacturing sector, and who had money available, but were really struggling to find bankable projects in that manufacturing sector. And I think that's a story that is often untold, because we sort of jump into the conclusion that access to finance is difficult. It is difficult, but if you have a bankable project, there is funding out there. However, development, and that's your point about the cost, the capital, basically manufacturing sectors or projects being more capital intensive and requiring more patient capital. is a correct one, and that's why the role of development banks could be bigger, right? Because then they would serve real development objectives, and they would have clear sort of priorities around those development objectives. Obviously, the commercial banks is more lucrative for them to invest in real estate and into other projects that are short term and that provide more money. And you can set up a way, I mean, you can think about ways to incentivize them to focus on manufacturing, but ultimately that could be actually the role of development banks. And that's why I've insisted earlier on the role of national development banks in funding these projects. But I would also argue that it is also about how do you set up these industrial capabilities, right? And how do you prepare African entrepreneurs to be major drivers, to be entrepreneurs in manufacturing. That doesn't happen out of nowhere, right? You need the right capabilities, you need the right tacit knowledge, you need the right networks, you need experience within the industries. And I think there is a broader, more strategic thinking that we need to do about how do we develop that pipeline of entrepreneurs, and then how we connect them how we integrate them into the global value chains.
Thank you for that, Chima. I was still going to ask you questions about just giving us recommendations on developing that pipeline of networks to build their capabilities for to start doing bankable projects. But I'll come back to that. Let me just ask my next question. Foreign direct investment often flows into oil and gas. How can we also get FDIs to also flow into manufacturing, of course, because of the patient capital? Can you advise on what can be done as well to get FDIs for sectors like manufacturing? Thank you.
Yes, so that needs a clear industrial policy that does need a very rigorous level of sector prioritization. And the reality is that each sector in manufacturing requires different answers and requires has different type of problems, and it requires different interventions from governments. And for you to be able to bring in investment in those sectors, one, you need to understand their needs, the needs of these sectors, the dynamics. Two, you need to target the right level of investors, including focusing on anchor investors who can crowd in then further investment in those sectors that can really set you up for success. The first wave of investors that you bring in, especially when you're developing a sector from scratch, is actually one of the most fundamental questions that you need to look at, and that would determine whether that it would be a success in 10, 20 years time or not. So strategy, clear thinking about which priority sectors we're going to focus on the next 5 years, which anchor investors we want to bring, and then working with them, problem solving with them, to be able to develop the right public goods for these sectors to develop, be it SEZ, be it the capacity of your ports, be it the capacity of customs, be it the workforce that you need to prepare, be it the trade agreements that you need to have access to markets. These are sort of very different pieces of the same puzzle that you need to put together. But for you to get those pieces of the puzzle, you need to engage with serious anchor investors who can help you develop these sectors. And you need to first prioritize in your policies, not go for all the sectors in manufacturing. There are very different sectors, one that can offer you an opportunity to enter from an assembly step, others that are more based on the resources that you have in country. So you need to understand the different opportunities, the different feasibility and the different entry points that you could have, and then work seriously on a handful number of sectors to identify the right level of investment to bring in and the right answers to the right interventions to put in place. It's not magic, but it's really, really hard work. And it's a long term also. It's not something that can be done in just 1 year or two. You need a real commitment, a long-term commitment to it.
Thank you so much, Shima, for that. One of the key things that you have highlighted here is we must prioritize policies in different sectors. What are the sectors we want to focus on? Once we do that and we've clearly articulated our needs, the opportunities, and the entry points, then we can get FDIs into sectors like manufacturing and other viable sectors. Thank you for that. So, in wrapping up, my final question would then be your recommendations for policymakers, because it is important. That's all the recommendations that you have for policymakers on practical steps to advance the industrialization agenda. Thank you.
Prioritize, 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 prioritize. I cannot say it enough because it's really hard um, to get basically policymakers to make real choices and real bets on sectors. And when we say prioritize, as I said earlier, it's a really handful number of sectors. It's not more than 5, 6 sectors. It's definitely not a long list of 13, 15, or it's definitely not saying we're going to develop manufacturing. Go as specific as you can and commit to it. And do not basically choose the quality over quantity of investment. And that's really, especially in the early stages, that's, I think, the most, as I said, one of the most difficult questions because there is an incentive to, communicate on big numbers. But communicating on fewer numbers early on, but that would have much larger multiplier effects down the line is a better way for your countries. So again, prioritize, 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 and then be embedded with the private sector to understand what they need. The government cannot plan the development of sectors alone. It needs to be done hand in hand with the right partners in the private sector.
Okay, thank you for that, Chima. And so we have it for our policymakers. Chima has clearly highlighted that we must prioritize. It is quality over quantity. We just need about 5 to 6 sectors to focus on, and then collaborate with the private sector to get the work done. And that will be all of my questions for Chima for today. Thank you so much, Chima, for making out time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts with us. We would also like to be a very big thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and we hope that the recommendations and the insights shared here can be used in further advancing the various discussions, conversations on intra-African trade, on regional integration and value chain addition. Thank you, everyone, and until the next episode. Bye-bye.